What if the greatest danger in the church today does not come from the loudest critics of the Pope, but from those in the middle? You know, those who claim to be moderates, to be fair in their assessments, who offer respectful criticisms, while at the same time slowly but very subtly eroding the filial devotion that is owed to the Pope. Today, we're going to unpack what's really going on and why it matters. Hey everyone, and welcome back. Very recently, the Catholic conservative journalist Diane Montagna leaked part of a report tied to a survey that Pope Francis circulated among the bishops of the world, asking them about the use of the pre-Vatican II Missal, the Old Missal, in their dioceses. And we must remember that the results of these questionnaires were pointed by Pope Francis as the reason for his issuing of Traditionis Custodes, the motu proprio, where he restricted the use of this old missal. But here's the catch. According to this leaked partial report, most of the bishops of the world did not see a problem with this old missal in their dioceses, and even those who saw a problem thought that implementing restrictions on this liturgy would probably cause more problems than it would solve. And of course, these raised eyebrows, especially among those who were attached to that liturgy and who were critical of Pope Francis, because they started accusing Pope Francis of having lied when he mentioned the reasons why he implemented Traditiones Custodes. Some Catholics, like myself, were quick to point out that we should be cautious with these accusations. After all, we only have part of a report leaked by a person with an obvious agenda. We don't have access to the full report. We don't have access to the raw data of these bishop questionnaires, and we don't know if this was the sole document that assessed the survey and on which Pope Francis based his decision on. And very quickly, these cautions were confirmed. On the very next day that this controversy exploded, the official Vatican spokesperson, Matteo Bruni, clarified that this leaked document, if it was real, painted an incomplete and partial picture of Francis's decision-making process.
So, hi guys, just an update. As I was publishing this video, Diane Montaigne released a new article supposedly debunking Matteo Bruni, but if you look at it, what she did was just release 2 or 3 more pages of the report, which is kind of strange. Someone is leaking it to her, so what's the problem in releasing the whole thing? No, we still don't have the whole report to make our decisions on. We don't have the raw data of the questionnaires, and we don't know whether this was actually the only document, even from the CDF, on which Pope Francis based his decision on. So everything that I said on this video remains updated. Let's continue.
In light of this, other Catholics came into the public and said, well, then everything will be perfectly settled if the Holy See simply releases all the documentation relative to this episode. Sounds reasonable, right? Well, maybe on the surface level, but if you dig deeper and ask these Catholics whether they had misgivings about Pope Francis, or on whether in this Traditionis Custodes episode their sympathy leans towards the traditionalists, well, chances are that they will probably reply yes. So let me put it this way. Imagine that you belong to a group of friends, and one day one of these so called friends of yours comes into the group and accuses you of some serious wrongdoing based on some shoddy fragmentary evidence that they dug up from your personal stuff. Mind you, I'm not talking about against the law wrongdoing, but still something that can tarnish your reputation among your group of friends. And then some other friend comes forth and says, well, I don't have a dog in this fight, even though my sympathy clearly lies with the one who's accusing than with the accused. But still, for some reason, I'm a perfectly impartial judge. So let's take a moderate position and meet ourselves halfway. As part of the accuser, I will just take whatever it is that he produced for granted and let him off the hook. He doesn't need to do anything else, doesn't need to substantiate this grave accusation anymore. No, now it's on the part of the accused to take the time from your day, as if you don't have anything better to do, to go through your private stuff and show me that this evidence that he produced is shaky, even though I agree that it's shaky, and so clear up your name. Suddenly, this person doesn't seem so moderate anymore, right? Rather, it seems like it is someone that is abetting the accuser. And this, in a nutshell, is exactly what happened throughout Pope Francis' pontificate. There were these Catholics who self styled themselves as moderate and who always claimed to be in the middle ground, but then, if you looked at their behavior very carefully, it was not so. Now you may ask, but Pedro, isn't it good to be moderate? Shouldn't we avoid extremes? And I say, absolutely. What is wrong is not being a moderate, but the misuse of this label to attain not moderate ends. Being moderate means being fair. It means being objective in your assessment of reality and taking decisions and actions that perfectly align with that reality. And as far as Catholics are concerned, being moderate means to stay rooted in church teaching and being loyal to the magisterium and avoiding that political biases, whether liberal or conservative, may cloud our filial devotion towards the Pope and lead us into constant criticism against the Vicar of Christ. At least that's what moderation used to mean during the pontificates of John Paul II and Benedict XVI, as I experienced them. But for some reason, something changed during Francis's pontificate. Suddenly, some Catholics became extremely critical of the Pope and they went completely off the rails and they started accusing the Pope of being a heretic or even of being an anti-pope or the very antichrist himself. Other Catholics, though they remained critical, were more toned down. They did not go full Pope Francis is a heretic mode, but they still cast doubts on his teachings. They doubted his motives and they spread a dark view of his pontificate, fostering an environment of suspicion against the Pope. And since these Catholics were more toned down, more professorial, more respectable, they tried to paint themselves as the moderates by creating a false spectrum On the one hand, then, we would have those Catholics who would accuse Pope Francis of being the very Antichrist himself, and on the other extreme were the loyal Catholics, who were then presented as extremes of their own by being labeled the ultramontanists, papalators, hyperpapalists, and other artificial labels. That way, they could paint themselves as being the moderates between these two extremes. And suddenly, being a faithful Catholic, as it used to be before in the pontificates of John Paul II and Benedict XVI, came to be styled as being a radical. Meanwhile, these moderates created more palatable versions of the extreme critical views, and this allowed them to normalize some of the least extreme criticisms than their fringier counterparts into Catholic discourse. Respectful criticism, they would call it. Let us take this Traditionis Custodes controversy, for instance. Some of these so-called moderates will certainly acknowledge that some radical traditionalists were indeed out of line. But then they will say that Pope Francis was excessively and needlessly harsh in the restrictions that he imposed because these elements are just a tiny, fringe, though vocal minority. It's just a few bad apples. But then, if you go and look at the social media feeds of these moderates, they are also filled with respectful criticisms of Pope Francis and his living magisterium. For that reason, they don't see themselves as part of the problem that Traditionis Custodes was trying to address. So here is a good rule of thumb. Just take any respectful criticism that you can see in those moderate feeds or articles about Amoris Laetitia or Fiducia Supplicans or Fratelli Tutti and swap in the name of the document with Humanae Vitae and change the topic of that document with artificial contraception. And then check if you would still consider those criticisms directed at Humanae Vitae as respectful criticisms that are within the bounds of orthodoxy. Also, when checking the social media feeds of these moderates, see how many times did they talk about Pope Francis in a positive light or in a negative light, and try to assess whether they were really offering rare constructive criticism when it was really necessary, or if they were viewing his whole papacy through a dark, cynical lens. And here's another thing that is also very interesting and dangerous about these moderates. It's how they shift their stances over time and then move the spectrum that they themselves created according to their convenience. Let us take, for instance, the case of Archbishop Carlo Maria Viganò. At this moment, we are at the first anniversary of his excommunication. And at this moment, he is considered by most Catholics as a fringe extremist. But it was not always like so. When Viganò first turned against Pope Francis, he was framed as being a heroic whistleblower who was bringing to light how Pope Francis had known about Cardinal McCarrick's wrongdoings and had done nothing. And immediately, all these moderates sided with Viganò because Viganò had been the nuncio of the United States, a position of credibility. And let us be honest, Those moderates already did not like Pope Francis at the outset, so it was easy for them to believe Viganò over Francis. Already at the time, Viganò's story had major inconsistencies, and I wrote about them at length in some articles that I published then and that I will link in the description to this video below in case if you are curious. Why had Viganò only come forth a few days after Pope Francis had indeed taken drastic measures against McCarrick, namely by removing his red hat? It was so obvious that Viganò was trying to shift the blame away from something that was within his own purview and onto an inconvenient pope who had cut off his ecclesiastical wings by putting a stop to his career a couple of years before. But still, the moderates just stuck with him. And even after the Vatican officially debunked one of the central claims of Viganò's testimony, namely that Pope Benedict XVI had already imposed canonical sanctions on McCarrick. These moderates then spun the narrative to their favor, and they said that the refutation actually proved what Viganò had said. And then they tried to twist the meaning of canonical sanctions so that canonical sanctions were not truly canonical sanctions. It was just whatever slap on the wrist that they could, fit into the reality that ended up emerging. And anyone who questioned their logic was brushed off as fringe. Fast forward a couple of years, and by that time, Viganò had gone completely off the deep end and was accusing Pope Francis and even the Second Vatican Council of promoting grave heresy in very colorful language, in a way that not even those respectable critics could bear. So what did they do? They flipped on him. And suddenly they were accusing Pope Francis of not acting, of not reining in and letting this dangerous person just roam free spouting his nonsense. Funny how that works, right? Just a couple of years before, if Pope Francis had punished him, they would be accusing the Pope of silencing a heroic whistleblower. But now, a couple of years later, they wanted him dealt with as the dangerous man that he had always been. Once again, their position shifted. Viganò, who until then had been a moderate just like them, suddenly became the new fringe. Pope Francis remained the other extreme, and they could place themselves in the middle once again, always the eternal moderates. But if we zoom in church history, we see that there's nothing new under the sun. Already in the Middle Ages, the church was passing by a very bad case of corruption, even at the highest levels, even at the papacy. And then there came a reformist pope, Gregory VII, who tried to impose reforms that would clean up this corruption. But unfortunately, many of these measures either did not survive his papacy or were not sufficient so that things eventually unraveled again. And some Catholics who were frustrated at the pace that these reforms were being implemented tried to take matters into their own hands, and these were called the Radical Gregorians. And eventually, some of these ideas even filtered to a branch of the Franciscan order that became known as the Spirituals or the Fraticelli. But even though their intentions started off as righteous and noble, they eventually strayed away from communion with the church, since they saw themselves as autonomous and took the matters into their own hands. They eventually became unmoored from the living magisterium, and then their beliefs started to become stranger and stranger until they could no longer be reconciled with orthodoxy, even though they believed that they were the orthodox ones. The true reform did not come from them, but from a man, Saint Francis of Assisi, who really effectively rebuilt the church, and he did so from within with faith, patience, love, through ethical means, through the proper channels, and with the pious disposition towards the church and the Pope. We see something similar with Martin Luther. He was right in calling out the corruption that came from the sales of indulgences, but eventually he saw himself so autonomous that he even veered into doctrinal territory, and by doing so he created wounds in our ecclesial communion that have not healed until now. No, the true reform came from within, once again, from the measures implemented in the Council of Trent. And that's what we need right now. True reform will not come from leaves, power plays, or stoking outrage to obtain a predetermined goal, especially when what's at stake is not mere policy, but even doctrine or the right of the church to reform the liturgy. No, true reform will come from people who are disposed to work from within the church and who really love the church. Not an idealized version of the church that they can sacrifice the real church to. No, love for the real church as she is. Again, true reform will come from people who work from within the church, from the proper channels that the church puts at our disposition. Or, in the case of severe law breaking on the part of the church hierarchy, it will come from the proper channels from the law enforcing authorities. But don't go around manipulating the media to manufacture controversies to get what you want on a specific hot button topic, and then say that you are doing good and that you're being a moderate by doing so, because you're not. So, as we navigate this latest Traditionis Custodes controversy, let us not fall into the temptation of being goaded by the intensity of the controversy into accepting what some people are selling to us as being moderate. They might sound reasonable on the surface, but they are trying to slowly push us away from what it truly means to be a Catholic. Let us remember what Pope Francis has taught us. Time is greater than space. And the moderates of today, when unmoored from the magisterium, are the fringe of tomorrow. If you want to be a moderate, then stick with the magisterium, be faithful, and be patient. Truth will come out eventually. Once more, I will leave a link in the description below to all the articles that I've written about these topics, and also a link to my book, Rigidity, Faithfulness, or Heterodoxy, which has a whole chapter about these Middle Ages corruptions and heresies that I also mentioned in the video. Also, if you'd like to know more about my writings, please visit my website, pedrogabrielwriter.com. Also, if you found this video useful, please hit the like button and subscribe so that you'll be notified when the next video is uploaded. That's all for today. God bless. and see you soon.